it was taken over by Spain and Mexico. And so this was part of Mexico. And so the people here were the Miwok Indians, the Spanish, and then the Mexicans. It wasn't populated very much, but the Mexican government had an outpost in Monterey. So that was the main northern outpost in this area, was down in Monterey. In 1839, when John Sutter came, he came into Monterey, and they told him if he became a Mexican citizen, they would give him a large land grant in Northern California. So in 1839, he became a Mexican citizen. He received a large land grant in what is now the Sacramento area and built Sutter's Fort. So those were the two main settlements in Northern California, Sutter's Fort and Monterey. And so the trail between the two became known as the Monterey Trail. And that is what is Highway 99 that runs in front of this building. So transportation was by horses, either by horseback or by horse and buggy. And they had to stop every so often. So usually every 7 to 10 miles, there would be a tavern or a road stop built, and they were usually called houses. There was one just 7 miles out of Sacramento called the 7 Mile House. Then this was the next one, and this was called Elk Grove House. And then as you went down towards Monterey, there would be others along the way. So the horses could stop, drink, take a rest. The people come in, get a drink. Like this is the men's parlor where they would come and get a drink, rest. Then they would continue on again. So communities began along avenues of transportation. And so this was the main avenue of transportation in Northern California. So this was the first site of Elk Grove, called Elk Grove House in 1850. This was built in 1850. Gold was now the United States had the Mexican War with Mexico in 1848, and Mexico ceded California over to the United States in 1848. And that was the same time right after that they discovered gold in 1848. And so when that happened, the influx of European Americans came out to California. And this became a very traveled thoroughfare between Sutter's Fort and Monterey. And that's why these houses were built, this in 1850, along the main route. A few years later, in 1853, a transportation route was made going east and west. And that was about a mile further north, where Elk Grove Boulevard is now. And that was along section lines of property. So they didn't have to go across other private property, but they went across section lines, east and west. So that made a hub there of a transportation. So James Buckner in 1853 built a tavern and a hotel there. And the center kind of shifted from here, where this was the only thing, up to that area where that was a busier hub of transportation. So in 1853, and then the post office. Post office was originally here in 1850. It moved up there in 1853. So that's kind of the second site of Elk Grove, again based on transportation. Then in 1868, the Western Pacific Railroad acquired right-of-ways from Sacramento going down south. And the right-of-ways that they acquired was about a mile east of what was Elk Grove, at the intersection of Elk Grove and Monterey Trail, Elk Grove Boulevard and Monterey Trail. And so they built a railroad there, 1868, and it was taken over by the Central Pacific Railroad in 1870. There were a lot of startup railroads in California, and then eventually they merged into Central Pacific Railroad, which was created by the Big Four. So that was in 1868, 1870, and so by the early 1870s they began, and the post office also transferred up there in 1869, and then commercial buildings began to build around the railroad because that was the hub. So that became the third site of Elk Grove. It moved up there a mile away, a mile east, and that became the third site of Elk Grove. They had a train station there, and the railroad then had a huge impact because it brought the the whole world closer together, the United States, and in this community, they could get to Sacramento in an hour or so rather than 4 hours and more by horse and buggy. Transportation of this was primarily a farming area that grew food products for the miners and eventually for even the East Coast. They shipped on the railroad from Elk Grove onto the East Coast in iced boxcars. But it brought Sacramento much closer, and the farmers could ship out much larger loads of grain and of produce to Sacramento, which that was more of a hub for the distribution of the products. The personal transportation getting to Sacramento, or eventually San Francisco developed as after the gold rush, and getting to San Francisco, to the larger cities. So it had a big impact on Elk Grove. Actually moved the whole city over a mile to where it was now, along along the railroad. So that's kind of the history of Elk Grove and the effect of the railroad on it. But like I said, it made the United States much closer. When gold was discovered in 1848, they did not know about it in Washington, D.C. for months because they didn't have a telegraph, and it had to go news had to go either by ship going around Panama, down around South America, or by horseback going across. The settlers coming out used to come out on a covered wagon, and it would take months to come out. This is an ox yoke from Euphemia Folks, who came out with her children. She was a widow. This is the ox yoke that she used coming out in the 1850s to California, being pulled by ox. And the building that we have out in back is the home that they built for her, and we're restoring that. That's the oldest house in Elk Grove. But where it used to take months to get out here by covered wagon, when the train came through, could be done in just a few days. My great-grandparents, who immigrated from Germany, came out in the 1860s, and they came out on the train from the east out to Sacramento to settle. So it was the railroad just changed, the way people live. The same as when automobiles came in, that was even another bigger change with transportation. But the railroad had a very big effect on people's lives and on the economy, and particularly on not only Elk Grove but on all of California. Still, the railroad is important, and it is spun off a little bit. We have rapid transit systems, but that's also very much like the railroad. As the cities grew, they needed mass transit, and so these rapid transit systems grew up, not owned by the old railroad companies, but by others, and many of them are public agencies that built rapid transit based on the rails. And hopefully California will get the rapid train system going from north to south, south to north. I've traveled a lot, and I've ridden the one in Japan, and I've ridden the rapid transit in Europe, and it's great. It relieves a lot of congestion when you're sitting in traffic. I go down south quite a bit, and I-5 is very busy, and if you could just get on, if they upgrade the railroad system to have a rapid transit and get down there in a few hours rather than 8 hours it takes to get down to San Diego, it's quite an innovation. the railroad companies all merged, and now what was the Central Pacific Railroad is owned by Union Pacific, and they've taken over Santa Fe and a lot of the railroads all over the United States. They're very protective of their right-of-ways. They are the only privately owned company that has a transportation system all across the United States. Extremely valuable for moving goods and everything all over. They have a monopoly on it. In order to get the railroads to build out into this wilderness that California was, the government gave them sections of land, a lot of timberland that they used to cut down and make the railroad ties with. And then sections of land that they did not use, they sold to help finance the building of the railroad, because that was an extremely expensive project. But yeah, it did change. It did change all of the United States. Again, transportation. Cities spring up, where they have the transportation routes.